Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be doing a retrospective on the discography of Blind Guardian. So this is going to be yet another one of my very lengthy retrospectives on a particular subject, and you can expect a couple more of these later this year, though I'll do my best to keep this one as simple as I possibly can. Before we look at the band's discography, let's jump into the history of the band for a moment. So Blind Guardian is a German power metal band that started out in the early to mid 80s under the name Lucifer's Heritage, before changing the name to Blind Guardian not too long after. They started out doing thrash metal in their early days before transitioning to power metal, speed metal, symphonic metal, and so on. They've released a total of 10 studio albums, as well as an album under the name Blind Guardian Twilight Orchestra called Legacy of the Darklands. It's basically an orchestral album. It's debatable whether or not this should be considered a Blind Guardian album, but I'm gonna talk about it in this video anyway, so yeah, we'll discuss that later. And their upcoming 12th album, The God Machine, is scheduled to be released on September 2nd, later this year. The band often take inspiration from literature, including the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, Stephen King, George R.R. Martin, Robert Jordan, etc. So if you're into that kind of stuff, then this band is definitely for you. And they've gone on to become one of the most influential bands in power metal history. Plus, on a personal note, this is one of the first metal bands I ever got into, so to make a video about them is kind of a blessing to me as a fan. So I'm gonna go through each and every single one of their albums. I'm only looking at studio albums as well as Legacy of the Darklands, and when The God Machine comes out, I'll have a review for that. So let's get into it. So, Battalions of Fear is a great debut, but it's honestly, to this day, my least favorite Blind Guardian album. Which is weird because before I decided to check out the rest of their discography, I had this album on repeat for a few months. And this was way back in 2018 or so. It's a lot more raw and unpolished compared to not only their later efforts, but the later efforts of the genre itself. And I guess it's because it's a bit more thrashy and more akin to American power metal. You know, bands like Riot and Iced Earth and so on. And I'm more into European power metal. I mean, the American power metal bands pioneered the sound, but the European bands took it to another level. And so did Blind Guardian to a certain extent. And while this album will definitely sound amazing to anyone who's new to power metal, it definitely feels like the band is still in the process of finding themselves, you know, in terms of forging their own identity and so on. Plus, while every single song is memorable, the album is kind of repetitive. You know, it lacks the variety found on later albums. My favorite track is Majesty, and my least favorite track is probably Gates of Moria, the closing instrumental. So yeah, this is a great start to the band's journey, if you will, throughout their career, but it's not the best they have to offer. You know, it's not an album that necessarily defines who they are. So I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. So Follow the Blind is a great follow-up to Battalions of Fear. It's a bit more in tune with speed metal, and it's a bit heavier and slightly more melodic than Battalions of Fear. The opening intro, Inquisition, is actually pretty cool. It contains the Latin chant from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Pie Jesu Domine, Dona Eis Requiem. I may have butchered the chant, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's a great intro to the album. And the band's first ever single is featured in here. It's called Banished from Sanctuary. It sounds a lot like what you may have heard on Battalions of Fear, but it does have a bit more energy to it. And the lyrics are cool because the song is inspired by the life of the biblical figure John the Baptist. Follow the Blind is based on the Stephen King book The Talisman, a book which I have but I've yet to read. And there's even 2 cover songs at the end of the album. Don't Break the Circle, originally by Demon, and Barbara Ann, which was originally by the Regents and the Beach Boys. And I'm not gonna lie, that Barbara Ann cover was such a unique way to wrap up the album. And while this is a great album, there are songs I don't like, and the band is still technically finding itself, because this album, much like Battalions of Fear, is very speedy and a bit thrashy to some extent, so you won't find any of their signature stuff here. My favorite track is Valhalla, mainly because of the guitar work, the chorus, and even the guest vocals from Kay Hansen, and my least favorite track is probably Fast to Madness. But overall, it's a great follow-up to Battalions of Fear, and I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. So Tales from the Twilight World is another solid album by the band. It's not one of my absolute favorites, but it's still worth your time, especially if you're into power metal. So the album opener, Traveler in Time, is arguably their best album opener to date. It's inspired by Dune, the Frank Herbert book, which I have on my shelf but I've yet to read. And there's even some experimental interludes, such as Weird Dreams and Altar 4. Another song I really enjoyed is Lord of the Rings, which takes things in a different direction and is a bit more of a melodic folk song. Plus there's even a song named after the Stephen King book, The Tommyknockers. And The Last Candle, being the album closer, is one of the most epic album closes in the band's entire discography. This is another great album. I don't like it as much as Follow the Blind, but it's still very well put together. It can feel a bit repetitive at times, and there may be 1 or 2 songs I think the album either could have done without, or they could have been a bit more memorable. My favorite track is the album opener, Traveler in Time, and my least favorite track is Goodbye My Friend. So yeah, this is another great effort from Blind Guardian, even if it's not one of their absolute best albums, and I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. So this brings us to Somewhere Far Beyond, an album that many consider to be Blind Guardian's best album to date. And I'm not gonna lie, it's a huge contender for that, but I'm not 100% sure as to whether or not it's the best of the best in their discography. This is where the band began to originate their own sound, while still maintaining some of the speed and thrash metal techniques from their earlier efforts. Every single song on this album is memorable, even the interludes. The album is filled with references to Blade Runner, Lord of the Rings, and even the Dark Tower series. Fun fact, the 2 Bard songs in The Forest and The Hobbit, which both took inspiration from The Hobbit, you know, the popularity of those songs resulted in the band's fans being nicknamed the Bards, so consider me a bard as well. If you like bagpipe interludes, which is a thing among some metal bands out there, like Korn for example, this album features such an interlude called The Pipe is Calling. It's the second to last track on the album. My favorite track is The Quest for Tanalorn, and even though there's really no song I dislike on this album, my least favorite is probably the interlude Black Chamber. And honestly, there isn't a single flaw with this album. It's perfect from start to finish. And out of the first 4 albums of their discography, this is easily the best one. So I'm gonna give it a 10 out of 10. So Imaginations from the Other Side is another significant album in the band's discography. The overall tone and atmosphere is much darker compared to their previous work. This is also when they started to shift away from the speed metal and thrash metal techniques of the previous albums. And there's a lot of components and elements in here reminiscent of European folk music. The album opener, Imaginations from the Other Side, is easily the best and most creative way to open up this album. You know, it's a lot slower and more melodic compared to the previous album openers that they've done. And it contains references to so many classic stories like Peter Pan, The Wizard of Oz, Lord of the Rings, and so on. Bright Eyes is also loosely inspired by The Neverending Story. The album closer, And the Story Ends, is one of the most breathtaking and memorable album closes that they've ever done. There are one or two songs that I've admittedly forgotten, but maybe with a re-listen, it'll jog my memory. My favorite track is Imaginations from the Other Side, and my least favorite track is probably Mordred's song. So yeah, Imaginations from the Other Side was a great change of pace for the band going forward. I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. So, Nightfall in Middle-earth is a concept album based on the Silmarillion, which is a collection of stories written by J.R.R. Tolkien that take place prior to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. These are pretty much the same stories that are being used as the basis for the upcoming Lord of the Rings series on Amazon Prime. The story revolves around Morgoth, the master of Sauron, who was the villain in Lord of the Rings, as he reflects on his defeat in the War of Roth. Aside from the songs, there's a couple of spoken word interludes that are narrated to tell the story. As far as the music is concerned, it's pretty much continuing what was done in Imaginations from the Other Side, though it delves a bit deeper into the folk elements. You know, there's flutes and violins and all that kind of stuff. And there's definitely some influences from progressive rock and opera. And all of this results in what is easily one of the band's most ambitious albums to date. There are definitely one or two songs that are kind of forgettable or just decent, nothing amazing. My favorite track is Blood Tears, and my least favorite track is probably The Elders. So overall, it's another great album in this band's discography, and I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. So, A Night at the Opera. This album was named after the Queen album of the same name, and this is, yet again, one of their absolute best albums to date. It marked a stylistic change in the band's sound. This album is more progressive and a bit more symphonic. There's a strong emphasis on overlaid vocals, choirs, orchestral keys, and guitar leads, and there's less of the heavy guitar riffs and aggression from previous albums. I mean, picture yourself in medieval times being surrounded by minstrels and things like that. That's the atmosphere you get when experiencing this album. This album has one of the band's best album openers in the form of Precious Jerusalem. That song alone really sets the tone for the rest of the album. And at 14 minutes long, the album closer, And Then There Was Silence, is the longest track the band has ever recorded. However, there are definitely one or two songs that were just kind of forgettable, but the rest of the album is still fantastic. My favorite track is the album opener, Precious Jerusalem, and my least favorite track is probably Age of False Innocence. So, overall, I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. So, A Twist in the Myth is considered by many to be one of the weaker Blind Guardian albums, and I definitely agree with that, but I still think it's a great power metal album. Basically, the band tried to return to their heavier, more aggressive roots with this album, while still maintaining the bombastic and epic nature of some of the later albums. There's some slower songs compared to what was on some of the previous albums. There's still some folk elements as usual. And fun fact, the first two Blind Guardian songs that I ever heard in my life are on this album, Scalds and Shadows and Carry the Blessed Home, because they were both featured in the end credits to one of the worst fantasy films I've ever seen, In the Name of the King by Uwe Boll. These are two of my all-time favorite Blind Guardian songs, and I had no idea that Carry the Blessed Home was about the Dark Tower. And another song I really enjoyed off the album is Otherland, especially for the chorus. Now don't get me wrong, this is a great album, but it's because of the direction that it decides to go in that it stands out as being one of the least memorable albums in their discography. That, and there are one or two songs that could have been shorter or they could have been better. My favorite track is Carry the Blessed Home, and my least favorite track is probably Straight Through the Mirror. So yeah, it's a great album, but I do think they dropped the ball here to some extent. So I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. So, while A Twist in the Myth may not have been for everyone, At the Edge of Time was definitely a step in the right direction. This album has grown on me the more times I re-listen to it, and I guess that what makes it so enjoyable is the fact that the band decided to recapture what they had accomplished on albums like Somewhere Far Beyond, Imaginations from the Other Side, Nightfall and Middle Earth, and so on. So there's a lot of familiar elements taken from those albums, along with some heavy orchestrations here and there. Lyrically, there's inspiration taken from George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, Wheel of Time, and stuff like that. I really enjoyed the album opener, Sacred Worlds, because the first minute or two begins with an orchestration straight out of a fantasy film or something like that. And even the album's single, A Voice in the Dark. There are some great melodic guitar riffs in there that'll stick with you after you experience it for the first time. And Curse My Name sounds like something that you'd find on an album like A Night at the Opera, so if you enjoyed the more progressive sound on that album, then you'll enjoy the song Curse My Name. The album is a bit too long in my opinion, and I think there are one or two songs that could have been better. My favorite track is A Voice in the Dark, and my least favorite track is probably War of the Thrones. So it's a great album, even if it's not the absolute best one they've done, and I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. So, Beyond the Red Mirror is essentially a continuation of what was achieved in At the Edge of Time, but even more ambitious. This album being another concept album, it acts as a sequel to Imaginations from the Other Side, and tells a story that combines science fiction and fantasy, where a mirror known as the Red Mirror must be found at all costs because it is the only pathway between two worlds. This is another great effort from the band, even if it's not quite as good as At the Edge of Time, at least in my opinion. The opening track, The Ninth Wave, is one of the best album openers that Blind Guardian has done. The single, Twilight of the Gods, is also pretty cool, especially the chorus. And there's some other great tracks like Miracle Machine and the album closer, Grand Parade. However, the album as a whole is a bit too long, at least for me personally, and some of the songs are a bit too bombastic and ambitious for their own good. My favorite track is the album opener, The Ninth Wave, and my least favorite track is Sacred Minds. But overall, I still enjoyed this album and I do think it's one of their better efforts, so I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. So the last album to discuss in this video is Legacy of the Darklands. Now, it's debatable whether or not this is a Blind Guardian album because technically it's not. You know, it's essentially the band's singer Hansi Karsh with an orchestra. The other band members aren't really involved all that much. So it's pretty much an orchestral album and a big departure from everything else the band has done. This is yet another concept album set in the 17th century during the 30 Years' War, and it is based on the character of Solomon Kane, a character that was created by Robert E. Howard in 1928. There is a tie-in prequel novel called The Darklands that you can actually purchase, as it takes place prior to the events of the story in the album. The album follows the same format as Nightfall in Middle-earth, where you have your songs and your spoken word interludes. And the interludes were narrated by the same actors who appeared in the interludes from Nightfall in Middle-earth. But even the songs themselves are pretty cool. You know, tracks like War Feeds War, Into the Red Dwarf's Tower, and Point of No Return. The best way to describe this album is to imagine Blind Guardian, but without the guitars or the drums and an orchestra in place of all of that. It sounds odd, but it works. The only problems I have with the album is that it's a bit too long, and there are one or two songs that are kind of forgettable. My favorite track is Into the Red Dwarf's Tower, and my least favorite track is probably The Storm. So overall, even though this technically isn't a Blind Guardian album, it's a Blind Guardian Twilight Orchestra album, I still consider it to be an important part of their discography. So I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. So yeah, that's it guys. That's my retrospective on Blind Guardian. So their upcoming 12th studio album, The God Machine, is coming in early September, and I'm looking forward to that. Next time, I'm going to begin another retrospective, this time on Westworld, the HBO original series. It's currently airing its 4th season, and so I'm going to start things off with a review of season 1. So look forward to that very soon. And yeah, thank you all for watching guys. Please be sure to like the video, share it and subscribe, ring the bell, take care, and I'll see you soon.